Thanks, Ron. So just a quick intro of myself. Henry Tam. I am with Redis, the company, and I'm the Principal Solutions Marketing Manager focused on driving our solutions across all the different industries, obviously including financial services. So the topic I wanted to just keep it brief and to the point, as Ron said, is around why milliseconds matter, specifically for what we call instant customer experiences. So let me dive right in. So quick agenda. We'll try to cover this briefly. I want to focus most of my time on probably the last two things, which is the customer stories of how a number of our financial services customers are using Redis today and some of the benefits that they derive. So why milliseconds matter? I think this has kind of been Redis's mantra from the very beginning. We know that real-time data is kind of the new disruptor. Every business, including obviously financial services, is becoming digital. Certainly COVID accelerated that. But mainly businesses that are digital are doing so because they want to differentiate themselves around the customer experience. And I'll show in a couple of my use cases how that directly is relevant to what Redis does. And then there's a big focus, I'm sure everyone's aware, around data. Used to be big data, now it's analytics, it's AI, ML, but really processing and analyzing and making predictions with data in real time really enables better decision makers and really drive business use cases and growth. And so really the bottom line is that latency is what we're calling the new growth killer now. If your applications are slow, regardless of the industry you're in, I think you're going to find that this is going to be very problematic for your business and for your growth. So just as an example, because I just happen to have just sent some money to Zelle recently, we know that mobile banking, things like peer-to-peer payments, whether it's using Venmo or Zelle or Cash App, those are the latest trends, especially for the millennials and the Gen Zs. Going to a actual branch at a bank is probably something that that generation will never experience. So really the key point here is that cloud native digital apps, mobile apps are really the forefront and are really what's kind of driving financial services, from both the traditional banks as well as to the neobanks and the fintech disruptors. But what are some of the challenges that are faced, especially probably by more the traditional banks that have the legacy infrastructure in place and are moving rapidly to modernizing their applications? As I mentioned earlier, digital transformation, moving to cloud. Just a couple of quick stats here. 80% of banking customers really interact at least with one digital channel once a week, if not more. 50% in this survey that we did of retail banks consider their legacy systems, specifically their things like databases, to be their biggest obstacle in making digital progress. And just a little bit older stat now, but 35% of customers have increased their online banking usage during COVID-19. I wanted to just touch briefly on why the second bullet point, the 57% consider legacy systems. And really, this has to do more with where SQL databases and the like originated. They came during the era of mainframes. As we all know, back then, disk storage was really expensive. It was really slow back then, and really things like Oracle and some of the IBM mainframe systems back then didn't really focus on performance and data access, right? It was really structured around the tabular format of rows and columns, and it really didn't match to how today's modern data structures, whether it's just documents or whether it's an object or visualizing data in a graph or time series data. All those things happen with the invention of things like NoSQL and of course database management as a service in the cloud. So all these things have basically hindered a lot of the digital transformation efforts that we've seen with our customers. So what are some of these real-time financial use cases? We obviously talked about digital banking and mobile banking, but even drilling down within that, what are some of the things that prevent that instant customer experience, right? Things like authenticating a user login, the session data, user profiles, digital identities. And then the specific customer story I'm going to talk about is how do you provide that true customer 360, providing, let's say, all the account information that you may have as a consumer of your particular institution. I'm going to talk a little bit in the part around payments of fraud detection. We all know credit card fraud, identity theft, all those things are rampant as financial services and quite frankly as all industries move to a digital landscape. That really just increases the threat surface even more. And so I won't go through some of these other ones, but obviously I think Ron mentioned in the trading area, quantitative trading, all of that requires instant data, reference data, portfolio data, real-time data, like even things like what's the weather like in Africa, for example, that might affect a particular commodity. So with that, let me dive into the meat of what I really wanted to share, which is the use cases. But quickly, before I jump into the use cases and the customer stories, for those that don't know who Redis is, I think Ron mentioned some of this earlier, but I will quickly say that Redis, the company, offers Redis Enterprise commercial version built on top of Redis open source. Hopefully by now, most of you are using Redis, whether enterprise or open source. I won't go through all the accolades, but just suffice it that we've been around for close to a dozen years now. It has consistently ranked in the top of many different database lists as far as most loved on Stack Overflow, most used, most launched container in Docker Hub for databases. And really, I think there's three key principles that Redis was founded on that drive us as the company and also for the commercial product, which is the whole aspect of performance, latency, right? Designed for real-time applications, both as a cache to help offload from some of those legacy databases, as well as being used as the database itself. The support for not only many different data types and structures, from lists to strings to hashes to hyperlogs to geolocation information, but also surrounding it with things like search, JSON, time series, etc. So providing that full multi-model support that is definitely in alignment with the types of data that are most in play. I think there is a stat, I'm sure it's different now, that 80 to 90% of all the new data generated is unstructured data. Again, directly tied to the whole digital transformation. And lastly, but certainly not the least, we're simple to deploy and manage. And with Redis Enterprise Cloud, it makes it even more simple. So with that, let's go cover the use cases. The first one I wanted to cover was this large US bank. They were having problems with their mobile app as far as being able to provide things like account balance information in a timely manner. They had all of their different account information, whether it was credit cards or one of their customers also had, checking, savings accounts, mortgages, etc. All of these different account information was really segregated or siloed among many different databases on the back end, whether it was Oracle for mortgages or using SQL Server for some marketing information. And then they had a IBM mainframe for their credit card information. So what Redis did to help work with this particular bank was to implement Redis as a temporary data store to prefetch a lot of this account information, including session data, user profile information, and of course, things like, customer information, account balance, etc., all stored on Redis using our Redis JSON model. And the idea here was that as the consumer for this bank was logging into their mobile application, it was already starting to be recognized during that login process, and that we were asynchronously prefetch a lot of this information from those siloed back-end databases while the login process was happening. Some of this information may have already even been prefetched previously. And so by having that user profile, session, and account data in Redis's in-memory data architecture, we were able to then serve that information in a much quicker way to that mobile application through that client API to all the different various clients that were being used to access their mobile application. So the net effect of all this related to my point around real-time and mobile banking and how consumers expect that kind of instantaneous experience. So with this Redis in place, they were able to basically provide that kind of real-time access and presentation of a consolidated, account view or account dashboard, if you will, to their customers. And that has tremendously improved their overall customer experience and reduced a number of outstanding issues and tickets that they were experiencing. The next story and customer that I wanted to talk about was in the area of fraud detection and identity validation. So we work with a company called Ekata, may be well known to some of you. But basically, they provide digital identity validation services. And they do it through two solutions that they call Identity Graph and Identity Network. And they basically comprise literally billions of identity elements from both obviously name, email, phone, IP address, multiple former addresses, a number of other identity elements that were all needed to be hit a certain P99 objective. I believe their end-to-end goal was to respond to a API call for this information in less than 100 milliseconds. Their existing solution didn't meet their needs, and so they started looking for other alternatives. And so when they reached out to Redis, and after doing some POCs, they were able to meet all their requirements of fast, fault-tolerant, and performant. They had, as I said, for the identity graph, they had a less than 25 millisecond P99 target goal. They need to hit at least 99.99% uptime to make it highly available and fault-tolerant. And for identity graph, they had to be able to hit at least 200,000 operations per second to meet their overall delivery goals. And similarly on their identity network, which is their complementary solution that provides more of the, I would say AI ML, where they enhance their identity data with things like velocity information. How often has that email been used? How often was it used in the past? Where are some of these information being used? So a lot of those elements are part of their identity network. And similarly, they have even a greater P99 goal of less than 10 milliseconds. So again, not to belabor a point, the whole basis for switching over to using Redis as the data store was to provide that fast, fault-tolerant, and highly performant database solution. So again, in this particular case, we are not the cache. We are the primary database for this identity graph and identity network elements.
Hey, Henry.
Yes.
One question, Rajev with PNC Bank had a question in terms of your policies, or how long do you normally store data in cache, and can that be customized?
Yeah, so we have a pretty robust way to implement different eviction policies. So all of that can be configured. I mean, obviously the most simple is a TTL that you can say after so much time, if you're implementing us as a cache, this type of data will be flushed out of cache after, let's say, I don't know, 60 seconds, or it could be 5 minutes. Now, in this particular case for Ikata, I would say that, again, because they're using us as the primary data store, that wasn't as much of a factor. But for the other previous use case for that large US bank, from a cache or temporary data store perspective, again, how they can change and manage those cache eviction policies are something that's configurable, and again, can range from as simple as a TTL or to much more complicated type policies. Did that answer the question?
I believe so. And as we finish up here, I'm also going to send a separate email to you and Rajev so you can follow up directly with him and the PNC team.
By all means, I'd be happy to get either discuss with him or put him in touch with one of our experts. All right, so let me move on. I'm checking my time here. I have 3 minutes to go, which is perfect. So just to conclude the discussion around what Ikata did, the other thing that they had a focus on was certainly the performance availability aspects were key for them, but they also had a focus on cost. And so, using in-memory, is still fairly expensive. And so what they wanted to do was then leverage something what we call Redis on Flash, which is basically a data tiering model that we have that enables that not everything has to live in RAM, but some of that data can be used on SSDs, right? Flash drives, for example, whether in cloud or in your data center. And so with this Redis on Flash, which we call a data tiering architecture, what we can determine is that some information is hot and needs to be in RAM. Other information may not be accessed as frequently, aka they are warm data, as we like to call it. And so Redis Enterprise does allow for putting some data in RAM and some in Flash, so that it still meets your overall performance goals, which I already alluded to earlier with Ikata, but they're able to save a significant amount of compute and infrastructure costs by not having all that data in RAM, but a portion of that. This number is as a generic example, but I believe for Ikata, they had 30% of their data in RAM and about 70% in Flash. And so that equated to, if I remember the specific numbers, several $100,000 of infrastructure costs that they were able to save. I believe in this case, they were using on AWS. So with that, which is, by the way, a good segue to my next slide, I wanted to really conclude with that fact that Redis has partnerships with all the major cloud service providers, obviously AWS, Google, and Azure, and that we have both cloud managed service offerings as well as self-managed offerings. From a self-managed perspective, we also are in partnership with a number of the key Kubernetes and cloud platforms like Red Hat OpenShift, as well as VMware. And so those partnerships enable us to then make it much simpler to things like consume your cloud agreement spend, your enterprise license agreements, your master agreements that you may have with some of these cloud providers. So just with that as a final note, again, for those that want to try Redis, of course, we have the option to sign up for a free Redis license to the cloud providers. And so you can get started right away. So with that, I believe, Ron, I'm just right on time, and I wanted to thank everyone for their participation and attendance to this, I think, really informative webinar. If you want to find out a little bit more information about what we do with financial services specifically, please go to the redis.com solutions page, specifically the financial services listed here.
Great.